Hello, and thanks for joining us for the final talk of the Huntsville Science Festival. Today's talk is Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and Mammoths, America's Fossil History. There's a lot to be said about Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, primary author of the Declaration of Independence, president, but not many people know that Thomas Jefferson was incredibly fascinated by fossils. In fact, there are contemporary accounts of Jefferson scrambling around on the floor of the White House East Room, sorting his fossils into different piles. So what is a fossil? Let's talk a little bit about that. There's the well-known types of fossils, which are fossil bones. You can see that in the representation of the skull in the picture on the upper left. There's other types of fossils called trace fossils. And the upper right is a trace fossil. That's a dinosaur footprint. Below that is a very unique fossil in the bottom right. That is fossilized dinosaur skin. It's really the imprint of the skin that was preserved with a fine-grained sand. Another type of fossil is in the middle of the bottom. That is a fossil plant that was preserved in a very fine-grained sediment, and as the plant material eventually rotted away, it left a very clear imprint. In the lower left is a fossil hunter, a young lady who's discovered a small dinosaur tooth in a rock that she found in Como Bluff in Wyoming. So getting back to Thomas Jefferson and his fascination with fossils, what was primarily known in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, the early part of the 19th century, were fossil bones of large mammals that had roamed North America. The reason was that was the type of sedimentary layer that was on the surface of the ground around the areas where most of the population of early 18th or 19th century North America were living. So what you see here is a card describing a fossil. This is in the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia's collection, and you can see that it is dated 1834, but the date it was collected was in 1806, and it came from Big Bone Lick in Boone County, Kentucky. And this was a mammoth. And you can see it was a species of mammoth known as a mastodon, and they named it Mastodon jeffersoni. And they named it after Thomas Jefferson. This is the actual jaw of that specimen, of this mastodon. You can see the huge teeth that this elephant-like creature had. Those were used to chew tough plants that were its primary food source. There's an interesting story that goes along with Thomas Jefferson and his fascination with fossils. At the time, the French ambassador to the United States was bragging about some of the fossils that were being found in France. And Jefferson was bragging about the fossils that were being found in the newly established United States. They would argue about who had the bigger dead animals. Was it America or was it France? When Jefferson finally showed the fossil bones that he had in his collection at the White House, the French ambassador said, well, it looks like you do have the largest fossils. Now, there's another interesting part of this story. And this is why we have Lewis and Clark in the title of the talk. The theory of extinction was something that in the earliest part of the 1800s wasn't clearly understood. Thomas Jefferson, as brilliant of a scientist and thinker as he wasn't really sure about whether animals would go extinct. And he thought that there was a good possibility that mammoths and mastodons were still roaming the unexplored American West. So when he authorized the expedition of Lewis and Clark to explore the American West, he told them, "I want you to find me and bring back a living mammoth." He fully expected that they'd be hauling behind them this giant elephant-like creature, alive and kicking, and bring it back to Washington. So Lewis and Clark, as many of you may know, they had the Corps of Discovery, and they traveled from St. Louis all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And it was a remarkable journey, remarkable in many ways. They had a young Indian princess named Sacagawea who helped them navigate the wilds of the West. And what was really amazing is that in the years it took them to make this round-trip journey, not one of their team, the Corps that they called the Corps of Discovery, died along the way. That was almost unheard of in exploration in that time in our nation's history. So despite all of their expectations to find prehistoric animals alive in the American West, they didn't find any. In fact, as hard as they looked, they only found one fossil. And that was this one that you can see in this picture. This is the fossil of a prehistoric fish that lived in the late Cretaceous. It lived in a formation of a layer of sediments that we call the Pierre Shale. It was found on August 6, 1804. It's one of the oldest fossils in the collection at the Academy of Science in Philadelphia. And this was brought back, this exact thing that you're seeing here is the fossil carried back by Lewis and Clark. So in March of 1808, the White House received a large delivery of fossil bones. This is what I referred to earlier when I was talking about Thomas Jefferson sorting his fossils. This is part of that collection. This is also at the Academy of Science in Philadelphia, and it's an amazing collection. As you can see on the right, the darker fossil bones are all the teeth of mammoths and mastodons. Not many Americans were looking for fossils in the 1800s. People in Europe, however, were going crazy about fossils. Dinosaur bones were being found quite frequently in England and in Belgium and in France, and people would find these bones, and they really were having a difficult time trying to imagine what the creatures looked like. They were finding giant bones, but because they were disarticulated, meaning that they weren't in the positions that they would have been in a live animal, they were trying to piece them together and figure out what did these giant bones look like when they were all assembled and made a living animal. The picture you're looking at were created by an artist named Waterhouse Hawkins, and they went on display in what was called the Crystal Palace in 1852 in London in Hyde Park. And this was the Waterhouse Hawkins idea of what dinosaurs looked like. The bones he used belonged to an iguanodon, and it means teeth like an iguana, and they couldn't imagine the upright creatures that we now know these dinosaurs really look like, so he made them basically like giant iguana lizards. The first dinosaur bone found in the United States was found in Haddonfield, New Jersey. It was found by a scientist in 1858. His name was Joseph Leidy. On the left you see a statue in front of the Philadelphia Academy of Science of Mr. Leidy. And at right you can see a photograph of him with the first bone that he called a hadrosaur. The hadrosaur is actually one of the more common fossil bones that are found. It was a large plant-eating dinosaur, and there is a whole family of plant-eating dinosaurs that are named after this type of upright plant-eater. They're known as the hadrosaurians, and there are dozens of different dinosaurs like Edmontosaurus, Brachylophosaurus, that are all named in this family of dinosaurs. This was the first one found in North America. So let's jump ahead 200 years, and we're talking about how scientists figured out how dinosaurs looked. This is a photograph that I took of a dinosaur fossil that was brought to the Johnson Space Center in Houston in 2008, and we took it there to x-ray it at a special room that they had at the Space Center. And I thought how appropriate it is that we're here in Huntsville, the home of NASA, to show how NASA helped us figure out more about dinosaurs. In fact, the dinosaur in that box is a member of the Hadrosaurian family. Leonardo, we nicknamed him, and he was a member of he was a Brachylophosaurus canadensis found in Montana in 2001. And he is a dinosaur mummy, meaning that he was mummified before he was fossilized. So look at the picture of what a hadrosaur looked like in a recreation from the 19th century. That's one of Waterhouse Hawkins' imaginings of what a hadrosaur looked like. And the picture in the lower left is what we now know they look like based on much more complete fossils, articulated skeletons, and in the case of Leonardo, we even know what the patterns of his skin looked like because the mummified dinosaur fossil showed us the different types of skin and their textures that covered his body. Everybody loves meat-eating dinosaurs. Everybody loves T-Rex, Velociraptor. This is the first big meat-eating dinosaur discovered in North America. It was discovered in 1866 by Edward Drinker Cope, and these are those original fossils of Dryptosaurus, and these are also in the collection of the Academy of Science. As you are probably gathering, the Philadelphia Academy of Science has one of the best collections of America's earliest fossils. And Cope's are amongst the most amazing in their collection. E.D. Cope was one of the most prolific dinosaur discoverers and namers in the 19th century. And he was in a rivalry with another scientist named O.C. Marsh. And Marsh was from the Yale Museum, the Peabody Museum in Yale, and he was a terrible rival. They would exploit each other's discoveries. They would blow up each other's fossil sites. It was a very interesting time. They call it the Great Dinosaur Bone Wars because these two were finding so many dinosaurs and wanted to name more than the other. And they really ended up filling up lots of museums all over the world with discoveries. So this is a picture of one of Yale University's fossil hunting teams on the lower right. In the middle top row is Professor Marsh. On the left is John Wesley Powell. Um, he was the first person to navigate the Grand Canyon, traveling down the, at that time, very wild Colorado River that flows through the canyon. And he was also the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, and he was responsible for sponsoring fossil expeditions into the West in the late 19th century. This is Professor Cope. There's a picture of him on the right, and on the left is Professor Marsh from Yale. And he had a lot more money behind him, and he had more government backing, the U.S. government. And he's with Chief Red Cloud there, who he took back to Washington and introduced to the president. One of the most famous controversies in the history of fossils during the late 19th century was when Professor Cope, probably in a hurry to prove he had something really cool, mounted this fossil in Philadelphia at the Academy of Science, and he put the head of the animal on the wrong end. And Professor Marsh noticed this before Professor Cope, and he humiliated Cope by very publicly pointing out the serious problem with putting the head on the tail instead of on the neck. In the picture on the lower left, we're actually looking at the actual bones of this animal, again at the Academy of Science in Philadelphia. And this was really what accelerated the bone wars, and was just a really interesting period of time. Como Bluff, Wyoming was one of the most prolific fossil sites in the world during the late 19th century. Both Marsh and Cope were taking giant dinosaurs out of that quarry. Well, there were several quarries. It's a fairly large area. And the top is a picture of what it would have looked like when they were using horses to drag the bones out. They would encase them in plaster and put them on sleds that the horses would pull. And these were some giant bones. Some of the individual bones, leg bones, were over 5 feet long. On the lower left, you see an Apatosaurus skeleton that was pulled out of the quarry. In one instance, they put the head of a Camarasaurus on the body of an Apatosaurus and called it Brontosaurus, which many people of a certain age, if you're over 50 years old, you probably remember Brontosaurus. It was a very popular dinosaur, but it really wasn't the actual name of the animal. It was a mistake. On the lower right is Dr. Robert Bacher, who in 1986 wrote a book that brought back the interest in dinosaurs to the United States, and he clarified a lot of misconceptions about dinosaurs, that they were slow, tail-dragging beasts. He brought back what scientists actually in the late 1800s and early 1900s understood was that dinosaurs were active. Some of them even guessed that they were related to birds back then. And this is a modern fossil site at Como Bluff. What we find now there, almost all the big bones are gone. There's almost nothing being discovered of a large dinosaur, but there are literally millions of tiny bones, and we call these fossil sites microsites, where you can sift through and find small bones. On this particular day, Dr. Bacher and the young lady there found some small bones belonging to both dinosaurs and prehistoric crocodiles. This is the exhibition that was in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington that opened up and really helped fuel American public's interest in dinosaurs. Like I said earlier, Europe was very, very dinosaur crazy. It didn't really hit home in the United States until this exhibition opened in 1901. And when people went in and saw that big Triceratops skeleton, they were astounded. What's interesting is that skeleton stayed in the Smithsonian for nearly 100 years before they realized it was 5 different specimens of Triceratops that had been pasted together, and it wasn't proportional. The head was too small, one of the legs was a little too long, but it still let people understand how amazing these giant prehistoric creatures were. And in 1905, Barnum Brown from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City made probably the most significant discovery of all time in paleontology when he discovered what Henry Fairfield Osborn at the museum named Tyrannosaurus rex. And these are actually 2 Tyrannosaurus skeletons that were on display in 2005 at the 100th anniversary of the discovery of T-Rex. So don't think of fossils as just dinosaurs, or even, as Thomas Jefferson knew, mammoths. There are so many different kinds of fossils out there. This is an example of a collection of different types of fossil sea creatures. Some of these are some of the oldest fossils that we know of. Those big dark ones in the middle are Dunkleosteus, and those are over 350 million years old. Below them are ammonites, some of the most common fossils. The upper left is the head of a mosasaur, which was a sea creature that lived with during the age of the dinosaurs, as did the ammonites. On the right side, looking straight into the giant open mouth is a Phactinus, which was essentially a giant 11-foot sardine with huge teeth. These are some of the very oldest and earliest fossils that are in existence of animals. These are over 500 million years old. It's one of my favorite fossils. It's because it's so weird looking. It's called Opabinia. It's got, as you can see, 5 eyes. It's got a weird jaw on the end of what looks like an elephant's nose. And it's a sea creature. And these were found in the Burgess Shale in southwestern Canada. Next to it, that spiky thing is called Hallucigenia. Hallucigenia was given that name because they looked at it and they still don't know which side was up, which side was down, if they were legs, if they were spines. It's just an odd-looking creature. And right above that is a species of trilobite, one of the most common fossils ever discovered. Most of these went extinct long before dinosaurs appeared on the planet. This is a giant ichthyosaur. Ichthyosaurs were first discovered in the late 18th century, the late 1700s, by a young lady in England named Mary Anning. And in fact, she's famous for having the tongue twister, She Sells Seashells by the Seashore, named after her. So this is a photograph of Dr. Bacher at the 100th anniversary celebration of T-Rex. And I had the opportunity to work fairly closely with Dr. Bacher on our dinosaur mummy project. So he built upon theories that other paleontologists from nearly 100 years before him had come up with. This is an illustration that was created in 1896 showing dinosaurs as leaping and jumping and active, something that for some reason paleontologists beginning about 1920 seemed to forget about and started characterizing them as tail-dragging, and slow and dim-witted. But Dr. Bacher's book called The Dinosaur Heresies revolutionized that thinking, or brought it back to where people thought where they were back in the 1890s. There's a movie you've probably heard of, Jurassic Park. Dr. Bacher's book inspired Michael Crichton, who wrote the Jurassic Park books, and that the movies were based on. And Jurassic Park reignited a tremendous interest in dinosaurs. And I had the great privilege of working on the films for 6 years. That's me with the Spinosaurus from one of the movies. Getting involved in paleontology is something I always urge people who have an interest in science. There are about 3,000 paleontologists around the world now. This photograph represents scientists from 12 different countries that came to study T-Rex at the 100th anniversary celebration that was held in Black Hills of South Dakota. And it was a wonderful gathering and sharing of ideas, and people really still have a lot to learn about dinosaurs and fossils, and interesting to see how much there is out there. This is a photograph of Dr. Ken Lacavera, who discovered what is now the largest known dinosaur. He found it in Argentina. It's interesting to look at different fossil collections. What you see in a museum is generally just a tiny, tiny fraction of what's in their collections. This is just in what's Dr. Lacavera's office space, and almost none of these will ever be seen by the public, but you can see there are drawers and drawers and thousands of fossils. The Academy of Science in Philadelphia alone has over 7 million fossils. In fact, many fossil discoveries are not made out digging in the dirt. They're made in the collections of museums. They're made in dusty bins and shelves where fossils have been sitting for over 100 years in many cases. They're also becoming big business. This is Samson, the T-Rex. It sold for $6 million. Before that, Sue, the T-Rex, sold for $8 million. And most recently, just a few weeks ago, Stan, the T-Rex, sold for over $30 million. The sad thing is some of these fossils go into private collections where scientists will never be able to study them. And again, the science of studying fossils has changed dramatically since Thomas Jefferson was sorting his bones and trying to figure out how they went together. This is a photograph at NASA of us looking at X-rays that were able to penetrate the fossil stone that the fossils had become and show us what was inside the fossils. In this case, we were actually able, without cutting open this very rare fossil, we were able to see its liver and possibly its heart. Everyone's fascinated by dinosaurs. This is astronaut Scott Parazynski. He was visiting us when we were at NASA. He's standing in front of the Leonardo fossil, and there's in the upper left a picture of Scott doing what was at the time the longest spacewalk ever recorded. This is a little bit of the technology we use now to look at fossils. The yellow container there contains radioactive cobalt that was used to help us create the images to penetrate the fossil. You can see a technician there. He's got a little heart-shaped red line around what we think was the heart of the dinosaur mummy. And this is a photograph of the dinosaur mummy, the only and most complete dinosaur ever discovered. And there's a composite of all the X-rays that we took looking inside of the fossil. This is an illustration that was made from what we learned from studying Leonardo. We know that the big meat-eating dinosaur on the right, a Daspletosaurus, was probably the one that bit him. On the left is a feathered dinosaur, something we've learned about dinosaurs in recent years. And that feathered dinosaur is chasing a very early mammal that would have begun crawling out of their holes at the very end of the age of dinosaurs, and ultimately, when dinosaurs went extinct, took over the planet. So America's full of fossils waiting to be found. If you want to go out hunting for fossils, it's something that you can contact a number of reputable museums and organizations. Just be careful you don't damage them. Fossils should be there for scientists to study, not to put in your pocket and take home. So how do you become a paleontologist? Study geology, biology, and anatomy. And the picture in the upper right shows what North America looked like in the age of the dinosaurs. You can see that the eastern and western parts were divided by a large shallow sea. Florida and most of Alabama were completely underwater during the age of the dinosaurs, which is why you don't find too many dinosaur fossils. Because the age of the dinosaurs was so long, there were parts of Alabama that emerged from the water, and you can find some dinosaur fossils in certain parts of Alabama. These are some small trilobite fossils that we found in Utah. So thank you for